Okay, everyone, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Erica Richardson, and I'm the campaign manager here at United Arts of Central Florida. Welcome to our How to Develop an Active, Engaged Board of Directors webinar. And to let everyone know, we are recording today's session. Today's speaker is Dr. John Curtis of IOD Inc. So a little bit about Dr. Curtis. He founded IOD Inc. in 1999 and specializes in providing board development, strategic planning, and donor-driven fundraising services to nonprofits nationwide. He also provides workshops, webinars, and classes on these same topics for the Edith Bush Institute for Philanthropy at Rollins College here in Orlando, and also at the Duke Nonprofit Management Program in North Carolina and Virginia. So Dr. Curtis, thank you very much for doing this today. And can you please tell us about some of the services that IOD Inc. offers?
Well, certainly. Thanks for everybody to take the time to be here today. I think you pretty much covered it, but our focus has been, and it's really the result of COVID, one of the things that we found in the world of pivoting, as many of you have heard, is trying to put together resources, much like today, frankly, that are low or no cost, because we think there are three core services that we offer that are really tied together and sequential. An active, engaged board of directors. Once you've got that on board, and for you today, many of you hopefully will leave here with strategies about how to do that, or you'll feel affirmed by the supposed expert talking about boards. You say, yeah, we got that, we do that, we do that. But once the board, if you will, has its act together, active, engaged, then it's developing a strategic plan. And then lastly, going out and raising money to fund the plan. So frankly, and we'll get into more detail, even in recruiting a board, you may want to say to board members, you know, we're going to develop the board, we're going to develop a plan, and we're going to raise money, as important as the core elements of an effective board. So that's in a nutshell. We do some other things we can talk about later at the Q&A at the end, Erica, but thanks for asking.
Yeah, and so I'm going to turn it over, but beforehand, if everyone could please make sure they're on mute, we'd really appreciate it. And we'll have some time at the end for questions. So Dr. Curtis.
Very good, thank you. Hopefully everybody can see this on your screen. And a couple things here just to mention by now, if you've not already, there is a study guide that accompanies today along with the slide set. If you've not, and you're maybe familiar with the chat function, you want to send a chat to Erica, but we'll make sure that this recording and those resources are available to you after the time we complete today. We'll finish on time at 2 p.m. Eastern time, of course. So, and the other thing is, anything that you see in the PowerPoint slide set and or the study guide, you're welcome to use. You don't need my permission. If you see something of value, throw it on a copy machine, steal shamelessly, as we like to say. So I don't want to limit anybody. Briefly, because of time, fasten your seatbelt. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Here's just a high-level summary of the agenda for today. Board member motivation. It's important to talk about that. There's some interesting new findings about why people volunteer, join boards, and so on and so forth. It has some relevancy to what we're going to talk about. What are the roles of an active, engaged board? What do they actually do and not do, for that matter? And that's one of the elements that we'll talk about. And if some of you have questions about the whole idea of what's board business and what's staff business, and frankly, as boards evolve and grow over time, those boundaries, those fences, making good neighbors, if you will, are very important, and signs of an active, engaged board, not micromanaging the executive director and staff, for example. The building blocks, there are three specific things I'll talk about in depth today that are back to what I said at the beginning, either affirming what you're already doing, yeah, we do that, or it may be some new information, some new insights, and some new tools that accompany that. And then probably 10 minutes till the hour, I'll work on a soft close and open it up to Q&A. And so feel free along the way. I know it's whirlwind, it's only an hour, it's a start, but today is designed to provide hopefully things that you have not heard before, or have them at least put together in a way that you've not considered. So one of the things I want to mention this, and this is really relevant to the idea of how to get your board engaged. And these are three key things that were found when it came to why people even volunteer in the first place. So as silly as it may be, scheduling and in board meetings, and some of you have toyed around and tinkered with, do we meet every other month, every month, in the morning, in the evening, and on the weekend, and so on and so forth? Just know that those that are volunteering these days for boards, both in Central Florida, elsewhere, of course, say, you know, if I'm going to be on your board, it's really got to be convenient to my schedule. Now, a brief aside, very relevant to what we're doing. The good news is, because of COVID, most everyone has moved their board meetings to being digital, virtual, online. And you all know the drill, and in particular, serving on a board myself in downtown Orlando and having board members that were, in this case, from Disney, and hearing them bemoan the hour-and-a-half round trip on I-4 just to get from their office, if you will, to the facility in downtown Orlando and back. That's chews up a lot of time. So for the longest time, I've been suggesting and pushing towards the idea of move to virtual, go online, and many times get a pushback. In the old days, oh, no, we like to be in person, we need to see each other. Well, the reality is, of course, with COVID, we're now doing it. So stick to that. You know, you may have a board that's saying, okay, well, now that we've all had our shots, or we can social distance or wear a mask, can we meet together in person? That's up to the board, but keep in mind scheduling is critical. A second element, we'll go into much more depth in just a minute on this, is proof of impact. People are not interested in volunteering their time that amounts to nothing. So keep in mind, whether it's in the recruitment process, the ongoing development orientation process of the board, or at least on a regular basis, giving them input about the difference that the organization is making, that they're making. And then lastly, and again, we'll talk about this in greater detail, what am I going to get out of it? There is a quid pro quo. I'm going to give you time, treasure, and talents, as the old cliche goes. What am I going to get back? And so we'll talk further about that. Here's what it looks like in a graph, and I've highlighted again in red the two things that are most important as takeaways for today of developing an active, engaged board. Let's make sure we meet at a time convenient for them, if you will, and we're able to verify both early on as they come on board, but on an ongoing basis, what's the proof of impact, whatever your mission happens to be. Now, having said that, this is a really critical element. We have at this stage, you tell me, Erica, how many people are now signed on?
We have about 37.
Yeah, 37 people, 37 different organizations, 37 different stages of development. And so it would be like me trying to be a classroom teacher in the old days of one room schools, K through 12, all in a room together. It's hard to be tailored to the developmental level of what's in the room or who's on this call. Some of you are, from a developmental point of view, a nonprofit that perhaps is less than a year of age. Others may be 2 to 5 years. Some are, 6 to 10 years, and some are 30 years old. So the role of the board changes over time, and let me try to explain that to you. And there are a lot of models out there. If you find this of value, go Google nonprofit life cycles and so on and so forth. But the resources here are summarized in if you're at the birth stage, if you will, 1 to 3 years of age, some of the elements of the board's role, and in particular, typically hands-on, mission-driven board members. So you're an animal welfare organization. The board shows up on Saturday and cleans out the animal cages, the dog cages, and empties the cat litter boxes. That's what a board does early on. If you're a homeless organization and providing food and shelter, the board is there in the kitchen serving the food and so on and so forth. Very appropriate. And exactly why maybe they've joined, back to what's in it for me, as a mission-driven board. However, as you evolve over time, just like the parent of a child growing over time, then it's important to look at that next stage of childhood, 1 to 3, 3 to 5, maybe 5 to 7 years, and the role of the board. And it doesn't mean the board still doesn't get involved in rolling up their sleeves and delivering on the mission. They're there putting the makeup on the kids before the children's play in your theater in Kissimmee or whatever it may be. But they also are beginning to look at how we operate as a business and understanding and their role regarding financial management, regarding marketing, regarding infrastructure. You fill in the blank. I'll come back and answer this in greater detail if there's questions about this. The next stage is this transitioning to the governance board, that whole idea of stepping back. We're now 7, 8, 10, 12 years of existence, and the role of the board is to make sure that the operation, and this is a really kind of an intersection of what I said earlier about the active engaged board that creates a robust strategic plan and then figures out how to raise the money to fund the plan. Donors and donor confidence is a key issue that is a topic for another day, but donors want to see that they're going to be potentially giving to a well-run organization. So the little litmus test here, taking of the pulse, if you will, I always ask of boards about this is, how comfortable would you feel inviting a potential major donor, which I'm defining as a gift of $25,000 or above in Central Florida as a major gift, attending a board meeting? How comfortable would you feel having a potential donor attend a board meeting? Would they see a well-run meeting, a well-run board functioning at a high level? Would they feel confident you're not going to waste my money? So it becomes critical as you grow as a nonprofit over time. And then lastly, and this is that interesting to find out through your Q&A a little bit later, if you're successfully progressing along the way here, or you're struggling with board members who don't want to take on this last role, which is about externally focusing into the community. We've got sound governance handled. Now we're out advocating, we're doing community relations, and we're fundraising. So keep in mind, like a parent raising a child, the way in which you interact with that child as a 2-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 32-year-old needs to change over time. That may seem obvious, but that whole childhood developmental model is a good way to talk about board development. So nonprofit life cycle and successful board transitions, things to keep in mind. And then here, if you will, are the keys to making those transitions successfully. So you've got this as a handout. I'll take a moment and make sure you examine it in case you don't, but I just want to drive home the point that the active engaged board is going to look different if you're a startup nonprofit than a mature 20-year-old nonprofit. What active and engaged looks like, and this model I think represents that and hopefully makes that clear. So moving right along, keep in mind when it comes to governance, and I'm just going to put all these up very, very quickly. I won't read all of them to you for the sake of time, but yes, there are other things they do. There's other things in the proverbial white space around these 6 items that you see, but at minimum, the internal governance responsibilities of an active engaged board you see on the screen. These are the things the board's supposed to do. And if you'll notice, not any reference here necessarily to programs and services, or facilities or staff, HR and those kind of issues. It's really about them operating effectively. And in particular, item number 6, which is always a good sign in the statement about a mature board. And just out of curiosity, I won't be able to see everybody here because of the numbers on the screen. Just with a show of hands, for those of you that have got your cameras on, I know the others that don't are home in your pajamas, so it's okay. Thank you very much. Please raise your hand if you, on an annual basis, the board evaluates its own performance. Okay. That's fair. Not bad or wrong. It's a developmental stage, but keep in mind, one of the things the board, we don't want to get caught up in kind of denial, if you will, and the number one stumbling block to development is deception. So let's make sure that on a regular basis, the board is evaluating its own performance as well. So keep in mind, just as a high-level summary, these are the internal governance responsibilities of the board, and then externally, as I said earlier, these 3 areas. And in a nutshell, this is really the board's external response. Be knowledgeable. I'm standing in line at Publix. I'm talking to you at Walmart. I see you walking the dog in the neighborhood, and I know, hey, I understand you're on the board at, or gee, I see you've got a t-shirt on with a logo. Who is that? What is that organization? To be knowledgeable, to champion, speak highly of the organization wherever given the opportunity, Rotary Club, place of worship, next door neighbor, and certainly be a donor. And that becomes another question. I'm just kind of curious with a show of hands. How many of you have a give or get policy where every single board member makes a financial contribution to your organization every single year? Just a show of hands. Okay, good for you. And that becomes criteria that we don't have to be able to tell a potential donor what it is, but imagine, and I have this happen before, seated with a major donor. Oh, one last question before we make our gift to you all this year. I'm curious, what is the giving policy on the part of your board, if you will? How much did the board members give each year as they turned to the executive director and the board chair, and they didn't have an answer? And the wealthy donor said, get back with me when you can tell me the answer to that question. So in the ask, jumping way ahead to meeting with a major donor, you certainly want to be able to, and by the way, Mr. and Mrs. Philanthropist, I am just honored and delighted to tell you that we have a 100% giving policy on the part of our board. Every one of our board members writes a check every single year. You don't have to state the number. Just tell them in advance. And so for those of you that grimace and worry about asking board members to give up money, if they're giving you $25 a year, that beats a blank. So be knowledgeable, be a champion, and being a donor. All right, so that's a bit of a lead in, some introductory information about the role of the board and what they're supposed to do. As was stated in the agenda, I'd like to go ahead and get into what I'm calling the building blocks. And there are three that we're going to talk about in greater depth today. Hopefully not so fast that they don't sink in and make sense. But again, at the end, feel free to ask me questions about this. Building block number one, an empowered culture. We'll talk about in more depth, obviously. Number two, getting the right members there in that, if you will, culture. And then lastly, targeted rewards. And this goes back to that quid pro quo I mentioned earlier. So this is really the nutshell, the core of what we're going to cover today between now and our Q&A time. And let's talk now about this. The first building block is about culture. Culture is, it's kind of how it feels to be there. Okay, it's invisible, but it's powerful. And it really is a compilation of things over time, the values and the beliefs of the organization, the shared experiences that the board has had. And back to that family analogy, and a way to think about what today is about is evaluating your board, depending on whether you're an executive director or board member or whatever level, on a continuum between highly dysfunctional and highly functional. You don't have to be a consultant to be able to generate a list right now. Well, what would be some of the characteristics of a highly dysfunctional marriage or family? You've seen it, you've known it, you've grown up in it, you may live next door to one. We know what it looks like behaviorally to have a dysfunctional marriage or family, and also a board. Okay. The other end of the continuum is the role of today, frankly, and each of you in whatever leadership span of control you have is to help move your board down that continuum toward highly functional. So each of you right now could take out a piece of paper and write a list of what would be the characteristics, the things you would see in a marriage or a family that's highly functional, healthy, positive, productive, safe, warm, loving, supportive. Same kind of aspect of looking at boards, what the highly functional versus highly dysfunctional boards look like. Two ends of a continuum. Okay, and wanting to move the organization down that continuum is a lot of what today is about. So culture is a place to start. And keep in mind, this is a quote from my favorite management guru, Peter Drucker. Some of you have heard of Peter. He writes a lot about organizational culture, now deceased. But this says it in a nutshell. It doesn't matter what we do as an organization when it comes to our strategy, the way we work, our fancy facility, our great website, the services that we're providing. If we want to grow and evolve and become sustainable, culture eats strategy. If we are a dysfunctional board, no matter what we do at the strategic level, at best it's not going to be fully potential, if you will, reach its potential. And it's arguably going to be limited. We're not able to achieve as much as what we hoped for. We're not able to provide as many services as we wanted. We can't raise as much money because our culture is not healthy, or the other way around, a highly functioning culture, and that coupled with strategy, and we could raise more money, serve more people, offer more performances, see more kids, you fill in the blank depending on what your mission is. So while culture is invisible, somebody jokingly said to me years ago, it's like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree. It's like, how do you get your arm? But everybody knows what that's like. You know what it feels like in your board meetings. certainly when you saw it in person, and virtually it's a little more challenging to see who's rolling their eyes and who's shuffling their feet and who's looking away. But nevertheless, what do you see behaviorally going on at the board level when it comes to the idea of the culture? So 3 key things to build the culture of the organization, and let me just all 3 up here. Plan strategically, and we can talk more about what that means, but I, as a board member, if I'm going to become active and engaged more so, or for the very first time, I'm going to reach out and grab a hold and begin to participate and engage with you more, I need to see we're thinking long range and big picture as much as you can do that in a soon to be hopefully post-COVID world. I need to definitely see, and this has really been accentuated over the past crazy years that we've all lived with regarding leadership across the country in a variety of sectors, not just in government, but see people act with integrity. Just no excuse whatsoever not acting with integrity. I'm going to not be committed, not be motivated, not be enthusiastic about you if I see shady stuff going on, if I may call it that, simplistically speaking. And then document impact. That goes back to what I said at the very beginning about why people get involved in the first place. So these are things to accentuate, to focus on. It may be for those of you that want to prime the pump to even after today, somebody may say, well, I know you were going to that United Arts Lunch and Learn webinar. What'd you learn? Well, one of the things I learned is the need to develop the board culture. And I'd like to find out how well we're doing in these 3 areas. Give people an anonymous survey, set up a survey monkey, and measure these, turn these into very characteristic of us, not characteristic, get some kind of score about how the board perceives you all planning strategically, acting with integrity, or actually producing results and documenting them. So how do you build culture? This is a strategy. Again, at the end, if there's more questions about this, we can talk further. So the second building block, and this is the one that probably is going to be most concrete and give you a real chance, as I said earlier, to either pat yourself on the back, say, gee, we're doing everything right when it comes to getting the right members, or we've got some ground to gain, if you will. Identifying the right members. So treating your board as a top priority, and by being on today's call is a statement that you're doing that. So hopefully it's not after the fact, but as goes the board, so goes your nonprofit. There is not a single highly successful functioning at optimum level nonprofit in Central Florida that has a dysfunctional board. They're mutually exclusive. So there may be a variety of things that you need to focus on. We need new facilities, we need new infrastructure, I need to hire more staff, but you need to focus on your board. So make it a top priority. Determine the sources of needed expertise. We'll talk about that. Where do we find these individuals? And keep in mind, not unlike fundraising, not going out there kind of tin cupping it. Gee, will you mind? Can you spare some change, if you will? Gee, would you be willing to help us on the board? Raise yourself up and realize this is a huge honor, okay? And you're seeking somebody who wants to engage with you and see that their contribution is going to be meaningful, but they're joining an organization that is making a valuable difference based on whatever your mission happens to be. So use that, aggressively recruiting and talking to people about that, and I'll give you some more suggestions about that in just a moment. Make sure you're accurate and honest. One of the biggest sources of upset, disappointment, and disengagement, the research says, is if what you told me I'm going to get, experience, or expect is not what actually I experience when I show up at the first board meeting. Those need to coincide, and if there's a conflict there, then I may feel like I've been misled. You didn't tell me how crazy this group is. The idea of inviting a donor to a board meeting, I'm not even sure I would invite a board member to our board meetings. They're so highly dysfunctional. So don't set people up for disappointment and frustration. Make sure you're being abundantly clear. And if you don't already have, I won't ask for a show of hands right now, but please Google board member job descriptions. Please email me. I got a bunch of them I can gladly send you, but make sure when talking to new board members, they clearly have a job description. They want to know what's expected of them. Many of us would, but make sure you're doing that in your recruitment process, if you will. Explain why they've been invited to the board. You know, one of the things, and I'll show you this in a minute, so I'm going to jump to it. I'm going to hold off on E and continue on and finish the list here. So some elements when it comes to recruiting the right members. Now let me talk about what I mean by item E. So here's just a matrix. You've got this in your study guide. This is just a sample matrix. I work with one group out of Tallahassee. It was an engineering group, all due respect to engineers, and they had an Excel spreadsheet and literally had 88 criteria they looked at. Across the top, as you can see, are the names of the board members. Down the vertical axis are the criteria. And so they would, before going out to recruit new board members, go in and identify, do we have butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and lawyers and marketing experts and IT specialists, tourism industry representatives, faith-based leaders, you fill in the blank, but do some kind of criteria where you have the board rate itself. So now back to what I said earlier on item E, now as I sit across you from the table at the restaurant or in the Zoom call, I can say, you know, every year we do an analysis on our board to look at the talent we have and the talent that we need. And we just completed that last month. Our governance committee went through a thorough analysis of all of our board members. And what we found is we're really lacking expertise in the area of risk management and insurance. So we started brainstorming, gee, who in our part of Central Florida, up here in Seminole County, down here in Osceola County, you fill in the blank, is an expert in the area of insurance, highly recognized, and your name kept coming up on the top of the list. Now imagine having that conversation in my role play with a potential board member recruit across the table at the restaurant or on the phone call or in the Zoom call. We did an analysis. We found out the talent that we're missing. We brainstormed who's the best in that area of expertise, and we found that your name was on the top of the list. So you can use this information, even taking along the matrix. I've had people take this along and slide it across the table and say, see, as if you will, evaluate it here, item 13, here we are in the tourism capital of the world, and we only have one board member, Alicia, who's in the tourism and hospitality industry. That's why we're recruiting you as a general manager of a big hotel on I Drive, whatever. So that's the role play about how to use this information to really help board members get back to credibility. Okay, they've got their act together. They're not just looking for any warm body, somebody that can fog a mirror. They're being very conscientious about this board. That doesn't mean I'm going to join, but it sure increases my confidence level in the fact that you're a mature nonprofit who's taking board recruitment and development very seriously. So don't underestimate the power. It doesn't nearly need to be this complicated. As I said, there's an example here. I'd recommend you set it up in some way, track on a regular basis. It may grow over time. You don't need 80 criteria, but there may be a lot of criteria that's not in this list here that needs to be added to the list. And again, that's in your study guide. And then I also mentioned earlier about expectations, just to reference the study guide. If you don't have this already, this is a great prime the pump, get the conversation started activity with your board. This is setting expectations of the board. Attend at least blank percentage of board meetings and so on and so forth. There are 8 items here of which you ask the board. Don't tell them what it should be if you don't have this. Ask the board to tell you how much should we give, how much should we participate, and let them fill this out. And then you can use this also in the board recruitment process to try to get the right members on board. So that's another, if you will, worksheet that you have in your study guide, and I would recommend that you consider using that. If you still want to, just while I'm on it, there's also an opportunity, if you've got this in place, there's a criteria here for the board member to rank themselves, rate themselves, and rate the overall board. This is one example of that annual board evaluation I mentioned earlier when I asked you to raise your hands. So that's finding the right members, if you will, and then reinforcing the right members. Once we get them on board, we don't want to, if you will, ignore or abandon them, just like a new employee. So, and some of you perhaps have heard this as a board member, and you're kind of sitting there, and she's been to 3 board meetings now and has not said a word. And finally, you just can't help yourself and say, well, Joanne, what do you think? And they sit back and say, well, I'm kind of new to the board. I'm not really sure yet. I don't have an opinion. You can't afford to wait 3 months, 3 board meetings, 6 months, however long it is, for a board member to make a meaningful contribution. So we want to talk about time to value. That's a private sector concept that means which is why you hear about corporations stealing top executives from other corporations, but they don't have time to develop that skill set and that expertise. They want to go steal shamelessly from another company. So they go do that. Well, in this case, we're looking for board members. What do we need to do to get you up to speed rapidly so you make contributions at board meetings? So you're going to celebrate the arrival of new board members by all means. It may seem obvious, but whatever that might look like, however you need to do that to make sure that people understand this is a very important process. It's a top priority. The board likely is well informed. They've been engaged in the process, back to evaluating, but don't underestimate the importance of celebrating the arrival. You may want to offer targeted orientation. Now, what I mean by that is perhaps they moved down from Akron, Ohio. They were on the board of a food bank up there, and they served for 5 years as a board member. And now you've recruited them to your food bank. Maybe they don't need a lot of details about food banks and what they do, but they need to understand Central Florida and how it responds to food banks, if you will, and fundraising drives and food raising drives compared to Akron, Ohio. So they may not understand food banks at all, and therefore they need a much more comprehensive orientation, but you may not want to initially bog them down with, well, we'll need you to be on site and visit with us for 2 full days. Haven't got the time, I'm busy. So a targeted orientation may be something you negotiate with the individual board member about what do they need specifically to get up to speed as quickly as possible. Well, you know, I understand that you're bringing me on board because I'm a CPA and you're really wanting my help in managing the finances of your nonprofit. So while I love to know more about the organization, since you've been around for 20 years, I'm assuming a lot of what's necessary to operate is already underway. Could I just meet with your CFO or your bookkeeper or your treasurer or the current accountant that you're using? Let me do that, if you will. Could I do that only as my targeted orientation? That's an example of what that might look like, all right? After the orientation, you don't want to just have them show up to an orientation and not follow up. So by all means, you want to meet with them and say, how'd it go? What'd you learn? What questions do you still have? Again, reinforcing their participation and recognition. Assign, and this is really item E. Let me not go so quickly here. So looking for a board mentor to sign up. If somebody comes on board, it may be the person who introduced the whole nonprofit and the board to this recruit. You've now gotten them on your board. So it may be appropriate for me to be the mentor to that new board member who happens to be my friend and colleague who lives down the street from me, or there may be a need to, if you will, pair them with somebody new and different. But that whole idea of existing board members as a mentor. So human nature being what it is, even among adults, I don't want to raise my hand and ask what may be perceived as a dumb question. So I can turn to my mentor. I can text my mentor. I can slip my mentor a note, or I can call them on the phone. Hey, they were talking today about the and they're exploring a new facility up in Leesburg. What was that about? I don't remember hearing anything about Leesburg and an office up there. Whatever. So I've got a resource I can turn to. And in this case, they happen to be my mentor. So again, it may be silly, or it may be something you want to really formalize. So they've completed the orientation. There's going to be a graduation ceremony. They get a signed copy of the bylaws. They get a job description. There's a little board packet, some way to acknowledge that you've successfully completed your graduation, if you will. And now we expect you to make meaningful, if you will, contributions to the organization. So some things about reinforcing the right members once you have on the board. And make sure, by the way, as they sit in, back to expectations again, they see you operating efficiently and effectively. And back to what I said earlier, the last thing you want to do is kill their enthusiasm by having them show up at a board meeting, their first ever. It starts late. Things are disorganized, okay? There's lots of tangents. Nobody seems to be in charge. The clock is running long. It's just not effective. And you walk out of there and, oh boy. Don't discourage that brand new person, just like a new staff member shows up, sits in a staff meeting on Monday morning and a fight breaks out verbally. So set convenient schedules and run effective meetings is critical to reinforce that new board member. Right, the third element here, if you will, I'm going to jump to that in just a minute, excuse me, retaining the right members. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So some things to expose very, very quickly and to run through. So one of the things is the the idea, and this is a model to think about back to continuums about the role of a nonprofit executive director and board, is to make sure that we're able to, especially in a time of COVID, when the research says that 1 out of 5 nonprofits in the state of Florida, there are nearly 80,000 of them, will likely close their doors by the end of this year. How do we maintain our relevancy? So don't underestimate the importance of that. Credibility goes back to what I said earlier. Would you invite a donor to sit in a board meeting? Visibility is, of course, about getting the word out and fundraising. So retaining the right members. Item B, that targeted assignment. What do they want to work on? Making sure they feel like they're making an impact. One other issue here, and I can send you more details about it, but you have as a study guide. I'm introducing this as a bit of a tangent, but for those of you that are struggling with committee structure on your boards, had a group down in South Florida last week. They have 11 board members and 9 committees. 11 board members, 9 committees. Okay. So this document that is part of your study guide is a study completed by, or based on a study completed by professors at Notre Dame's University's nonprofit program, that all nonprofits only need 3 committees. So part of what today is about, you're listening to me cover all this ground very, very rapidly. Among other things, you need to come away with some suggestions about your committee structure. Read this document, but what is being stated here is that you need an internal affairs committee, programs, facilities, staff, finances. You need an external affairs committee, community relations, advocacy, fundraising, and you need a governance committee, and that is it. Unless you're a huge nonprofit, the odds are you don't need any more than those 3 committees. So if you got an audit committee, that's part of the internal affairs. You got an HR committee, that's part of the internal affairs. You got an events committee, that's part of the external affairs. You got a board, if you will, recruitment and board orientation committee, that's part of the governance committee. And bring those together under those 3 committees. If you're struggling with your committee structure, I'm just recommending that you consider that. By the way, item number D, for those of you that long-term members, we won't get into term limits unless you raise that in the Q&A in about 10 minutes. But if you don't have term limits built into your bylaws, or if you have them and don't practice them, start, please. Funders will begin to turn you down if you don't have them in your bylaws, and you begin to, if you will, perpetuate ineffective practices by leaving existing board members. Now, a board emeritus, moving into a volunteer status, but bless and release is a good phrase, if you will, when it comes to the whole issue of board members. The reorientation of existing board members, by the way, if in fact you never had a board orientation, you've got long, your bylaws say 3 2-year terms with a year in between. All right, so I could have 9-year history with you, but when I joined the board, there was no orientation. We were barely keeping the lights on. Now we've grown, we're sophisticated, we're a $2 million budget, and you've got a board orientation program. I need to go through it because I didn't even know we had an office in Kissimmee. I didn't realize we offered that after-school program at the local whatever. So keep in mind to have board members remain, remember, knowledgeable, champions, and donors. Don't assume long-term veteran board members really understand what's going on in your organization if it's grown and morphed and become more complex over time. And then developing a career path, which really gets into our 3rd and final building block for today. And I'll talk more about that in detail. So again, a lot to digest, but this is about building block number 2, the right members, getting them on board and keeping them on board. The third area I want to talk about, this may seem a little strange since obviously you can't pay board members, no. And this is a concept I like to think might be new and different for you to think about, and that is recruiting board members and having a discussion about the benefits and compensation package. Huh? You might think to yourself, let's talk about that. The benefit and compensation package for board members, targeted rewards. So early on in the discussion, well, now that you've heard why I'm talking to you today, we did our board analysis. Your name came up as the top insurance woman in Kissimmee. We're talking to you about joining our board. But now that you've learned about us, heard about us, been to our website, gotten our case for support, what do you see would be a benefit for you? What motivates you to potentially consider community service, and in particular on our after-school at-risk youth program here in Kissimmee, whatever. Okay, so talk to them about that. articulate to them. And this is one of the things that used to happen routinely. And I remember hearing this from SunTrust before transitions in ownership and all of that. When executives were transitioned from Atlanta to Orlando, they had a mandate to join boards to learn the community. And so you may have somebody who's looking, I'm new to the area, there's such a transient population, people moving to Central Florida. I, as a business person, may be looking for a board to join. Let them know as a result of joining our board, you're going to learn a whole lot more about something you don't maybe normally have privilege to or have a chance to see. So what are their opportunities there? What's the feel good? It'll just feel good knowing I'm giving back to my community. Oh, I get to practice my faith, because you're a faith-based organization. Whatever it may be, but have them talk about that, ask them questions about that. What's the feel good for you? What are you looking for out of your board service? And then lastly, recognition. One of the things we like to do is reinforce and reward board members. Is this something that you would be willing to do? Would you participate in a group photo that we take each year of the board and we put on our website? Can we give you a plaque for your years of service, or would you like to remain anonymous? But have the discussion with board members about benefits and compensation. And then as you get really sophisticated down the road in your evaluation, you may want to ask board members, well, a year ago, you told us you wanted these 3 things out of being on our board. How are we doing in meeting your needs? See the difference in the conversation? It goes both ways. How are we doing in meeting your needs as a board member? You got to get them to articulate their needs in the first place. I had a group that was an environmental group comprised of a lot of retirees, business people in most cases, supporting an environmental group, and nobody ever asked them why they were on the board. And so we went around at the beginning of the board meeting and said, why do you give of your time, treasure, and talent? And they began to articulate a story or two, which is their elevator speech, by the way. They said why they've chosen to join. Capture that, write that down. Make sure you reference that once a year in your performance appraisal in your meeting as the board chair and or executive director, likely a board chair and the chair of the governance committee, by the way, in your 3-committee structure. And you told us, gosh, it was months ago now, that you really joined our board because you value our mission and whatever. Just have that conversation. It goes both ways. Talk about targeted rewards and ask them about what those rewards would be. So, and that's really what I meant here. It would be interesting to see if anybody who's on this call today, as we begin to transition into Q&A and begin to prepare for our closing at 2 today, if anybody is willing to unmute themselves and say, why did you join the board of the nonprofit you're on right now? So that covers it in a very rapid nutshell, if you will. What I want to do is open it up to Q&A and the takeaways out of today, but let me stick with that question for a moment. Is anybody on the call who is a board member who's willing to unmute themselves and say, so why are you serving? Here you are on Thursday, taking an hour out of your day on top of what you already do as a board member. Why? Anybody on the call willing to unmute themselves and tell us, why are you on the board of the nonprofit that you're on? And feel free to give a 30-second plug for the nonprofit that you're on. Anybody willing to be game and take me up on this? I see Rachel raising her hand. Go for it, Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Hunter, and I'm the chair of the board for Central Florida Vocal Arts in Upper Del Sol. And I am on this board for 2 reasons, maybe 3. The first is because I care deeply about our arts community here in Orlando. I'm proud to be a member of our Orlando arts community, and I want to see the arts thrive. And that goes for post-pandemic, during the pandemic, in general. I believe that the arts, and specifically in this case, it's performing arts. We're called Central Florida Vocal Arts, but we are many various different artists and musicians in our community. And I also believe that the power of arts education to be a great equalizer and a great tool to help inspire youth in our community to be better people, not just to be professional artists. So I'm involved with this organization because of the arts advocacy, and because I am a lover of performing arts here in Central Florida.
Thank you, Rachel. Three things, if I may use you as a bit of a guinea pig. One, in this day and age of Zoom, since recording, if you will, this session, the whole idea of doing this with board members via Zoom and record that and then save that video and play it back. So it's a chance to evaluate. Secondly, part of what I've done today while talking about different types of missions, knowing you all are connected through United Arts around the issue of arts and culture organizations. And the beauty of that, because what you bring up is back to relevancy. You talked about arts education and its role. In another city in North Carolina, they were analyzing arts organizations and asked them about secondary missions. And it was 11 or 13 arts organizations who also, 9 of them had feeding programs. When they got kids there after school on the weekend, they also fed them. And so they figured out a way to collaborate more with a local food bank and a charity kitchen down the street. And I think 5 of them had tutorial programs for academic performance. And so while they were an arts organization, they were also feeding the kids and also helping them with their academic performance. So back to people, and with all due respect to everybody here in this time of COVID, you may get pushback from people who say, you know, the arts are nice to have, but they're not a gotta have. If you're a children's dance theater, it's nice to have you around, but we gotta have the food bank. Well, don't let them get away with undermining your relevancy and the difference that you make in the community, even though you're just an arts organization. Rachel, that was a great example. Thank you so much. Maybe one more. Anybody else is a board member? Why are you on the board? And a little plug for your organization like Rachel did. Okay, fair enough. We're right about, I got about 10 or 12 minutes in. I like to open it up to Q&A. Everything is allowed. Nothing's off limits, whether you want to unmute yourself, if you will, and state the question or type it in the chat window. If you all are not familiar with the chat, there's a little box at the bottom that says chat. That should reveal a panel on the side where you can literally type in the question. But I'd love to open it up to anything that I've covered. We've gone through a lot very, very quickly. Questions about, and if I may actually, to interrupt my own question, Erica, anything in particular I need to highlight or underscore from your perspective at United Arts before we deal with their questions?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much, John, for hosting this. It's been such a great session. To let everyone know, before we move into the Q&A, we actually do have our next webinar session scheduled with John, which will be how to conduct a successful strategic planning process. That will be held on Thursday, May 13th from 1 to 2 p.m. And I'll be sending out a post-meeting email with some more information about that if you'd like to register for that as well. One question I have that I know several of the groups will be interested in, John, would be, we have our collaborative campaign for the arts going on right now. As we know, it's a very large arts campaign in our community. We're working to raising $3.2 million for the arts in Central Florida. And several of the groups are on here that are participating. We're in the final 2 weeks of the campaign. What tips would you have for them and their boards for that final push?
Great question. Tough one in particular. Just out of curiosity, a little show of hands. How many of you have board members? How many of you yourself, if you will, like to ask people for money? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Not a lot of board members will raise their hand. Staff should be, certainly. But keep in mind, at this stage, it's understandable that just inherent, I can think in the personality is asking people for money. How many of you like, and this is a question I posed to a board, how many of you like to help people solve their problems? So, well, sure, yeah, but keep in mind, so back to relevancy again, equipping your board, and it can be through rehearsal and practice to say, remember, for donors, their struggle, and this is the data is pretty clear about this, donors are suspect. You know, there are scams everywhere. And they're getting more sophisticated all the time, whether it's the telemarketing call at 6 in the evening or the email that pops up that looks very legitimate. Horror stories about misuse of PPP loan monies from nonprofit executives. The guy in Miami bought a Lamborghini with $300,000 of PPP money. So the point is, you got donors that are scared, fearful, reluctant to give. So the role of the board member could be to say, let me tell you about who we are and the difference we make and the impact we're having. So they're being friend raisers. They're not trying to ask for money. They're trying to say to the donor, we know that you give away some of your wealth every year, and I want to let you know why we may be a great place to give to, because last year alone, we saw 688 kids. We took them through 4 different art programs that we have, and we could double the number of kids and begin to have them articulate, a little like Vanessa was doing earlier, Rachel, excuse me, the specifics about why you're on the board. So have them be friend raisers. Okay. Secondly, and if you've got somebody who says, don't ask me to ask anybody for money, so, well, would you develop the relationship right up until it's time for the ask, and then call us, call our director of development, call Susan, who's a realtor who sells high-end homes down in Southwest Orlando and is very comfortable talking about million-dollar contracts, somebody who is comfortable talking about that level. But the third thing that I think is most important is really identifying and getting people to contribute names. And so right now in the home stretch, who are the top 10 potential donors that are known among the board members? And identify those very, very quickly, not unlike a matrix like this, and then say who has the strongest relationship with them, who's willing to reach out to them, and find out, if you will, if you can get a few minutes of their time over the phone to educate them about your relevancy, the difference that you're making, and why you're a safe bet, you're a safe investment. So helping board members feel more confident. Now, the other big picture, just to mention, if you've got a board member who doesn't want to do fundraising, keep in mind it's time, just like if you have a bad employee, you probably made a bad hire. So if you've got problematic employees, you need to go back and look at your hiring system and allow them to get selected in the first place. If you have a board member who sits back and says, no, I'm not going to do that, then you may be stuck with them for 2 more years, but make sure you change your board recruitment and orientation process to know one of the key roles that we're asking you to play is fundraising. So that's after the fact, and you haven't got 2 weeks to do that. The one other thing is, if you've got a board member who is good at asking for money, rather than a staff member saying it, rather than an executive director saying it, to have that board member report out what they do to raise money, the steps that they take. I had a gentleman, that same group that we asked down in South Florida about, why are you on the board? And this one gentleman, John, coincidentally was named, so well, I don't like to fundraise, but he had organized a tour of 6 couples in his high-end golf community that he was going to take on a pontoon boat tour, and didn't realize that's friend raising. And so that was reported to the director of development, who joined the pontoon boat ride and just gave not an appeal for money, but a case for support. So board members may be doing more fundraising and friend raising than they realize. Get board members to report that out to other board members. So that's a lot of detail, but that's thank you, Erica, for asking that. About 7 more minutes. Questions about anything else, including what I covered so fast you couldn't keep up? Questions? Help me out here.
I see, Dr. Curtis, that we have a question in the chat about how much is too much when it comes to bugging board members for money, and by money they mean donations and help fundraising.
See, and that's a great example back to asking your 3-year-old versus your 33-year-old. So board, one of the things that I'm really concerned about in being sensitive to in this day and age has to do with overkill and bugging you too much. So tell me, what is your comfort level? Back to this blanket. What is your comfort level? How often can I check in with you? How much do you think is fair? So ask the board to tell you, like asking your adult child what they think, what they feel, what they believe when they're asking for advice versus the 3-year-old that you give advice to. So as quickly as possible, I would really transition it to letting the board tell you what is fair and what is appropriate. And also giving permission, like if I do reach the saturation point, it's really okay to say time out and stop. As a matter of fact, at today's board meeting, before we go any further, as I role play, can we get a show of hands of how many of you say that the level of my interaction with you about donation is about right? Show of hands, please. How many of you think it's not enough? How many of you think it's too much? Just ask them. You know, back to emotional maturity and the characteristics of a highly functioning board. One, like a healthy marriage, a healthy family, a healthy board, we should be able to have that conversation openly and honestly and be authentic and not anybody get their feelings hurt about it. So I would ask the board to have them tell you about that. So how much is too much when it comes to bugging board members for money? So, and by money, I mean donations and help fundraising. Some of you may have a gotta give money requirement. Some of you may have a get. I don't have to give you money, but I have to go raise the money. And I would offer you have both. Those things that are important in our lives. Check to Publix. Okay. There's a check to your mortgage company in there. That's what's important to you. Is there a check to the nonprofit in there? So they may say, I'm too poor. I don't have any money to give. Could it be $5 a month? The gesture of doing that is important. So anyway, next question. Who do you recommend attending board meetings? This gets interesting. And see, this is back to kind of diagnosing and then prescribing. If you have a board that is micromanaging, then you may want to excuse staff and stick to board business, get the board chair to create an agenda that focuses on governance, community relations, advocacy, and fundraising. Don't have the staff reporting about programs and services and a new art program that you want to start. Separate them out. I learned this lesson working with a group in Atlanta. They wanted to have a strategic planning retreat. Thank you for bringing that up, by the way. As was stated at the very beginning, a sound board that creates a good, robust strategic plan that raises money. In May, our next session is on strategic planning. They wanted a separate staff retreat than a board retreat. And I was reluctant because I think everybody ought to be in the room together and happy, but it was really brilliant because when we got to the board retreat, the staff was there to do a 30-minute presentation as to the goals and objectives. The staff, this is a senior services nonprofit, had identified for itself. And now as that staff person literally left the room, the board chair could turn to the board and say, so now what are we going to focus on that's our area of responsibility? So having them in the room or not having them in the room may be a way to help address the issue of micromanaging, or a board that's so disengaged, you do invite staff members to show up and be a part of the presentation, if you will. The other side of the coin are staff members that may feel disempowered, dishonored somehow or another because they can't come to board meetings. And this is another issue for executive directors that want to control things so much so that they don't want staff in the room with the board. And I think there's an argument to say, discuss that, find out from the board what they like. Maybe there's a mixture and a hybrid where we start together and then we excuse the staff. So it's really one of those things I'd go back to. What do they want? Ask the staff, ask the board about their comfort level and participation. Next question. Ask or type in the chat window. We got about 2 more minutes left before we wrap up. We will end on time. Well, I take that back, actually. We allow you to officially drop off. I'll hang out longer if you've got questions. I promised Erica I would do that, and I would do so today. Vicki, did I see a hand go up?
I got a quick one for you to wrap us up. As most of us are now emerging out of the other end of vaccination efficacy, we are beginning to have these discussions with our board about returning to in-person meetings versus hybrid meetings. And there is concern that if we have maybe every other is an in-person meeting and in between is hybrid, that we will kill the attendance at the in-person meetings because it's much preferable for people just to dial in from home in their PJs or on their way to the office. But at the same time, there is some great value in meeting face-to-face. So what do you project that the rest of 21 and 2022 will bring in terms of how boards meet?
Fair question. I think it begins to look at who's on the board in the first place. If you got a group of retirees, they may have the spare time and they'll come to the board meeting in person. If you got a group of busy business people, they may love staying virtual. Give them the choice, give them the opportunity. But the other thing, and you all may know this, I've learned and it happened with a Duke class I had. It was 6 hours long, okay, in person, had done it for several years in a row, and I had to 9 months ago teach it, if you will, via bells and whistles and opportunities to put people in small groups. And I would really, really recommend you begin to learn more of the features of Zoom, of taking polls, of putting people in small groups, reporting back, trying to make it more engaging than some of you right now that are sort of passively listening. You've got your microphone off, you got your camera off, and you're multitasking. Don't let them get away with that. Use Zoom to try to create the interaction. And say, what do you all want to do? Let's experiment for another 6 months at this virtual model, and then let's revisit it in 6 months. Don't feel like you've got to make a permanent decision today because this whole COVID situation is so dynamic anyway. Are we going to have our 4th or 5th wave or whatever? So we're officially at 2 o'clock. If you got to go, you got to go. If you want to stay and continue to deal with questions, Eric, I assume you've got a few more minutes to stay and help us out. Great. Thank you all for being here. Go in peace, make a difference in the world. Those of you that got questions, I will stay if you want to ask them by unmuting yourselves or type them into the window. And again, that date in May, again, Erica, is?
It is on Thursday, May 13th from 1 to 2, and I'll send out a post-meeting email with some more information.
Same configuration, how to do strategic planning. So other questions or comments? Anybody at all? Folks are hanging around.
I'm curious. I recognize a few people, but I'm curious how many people that are still in the call are like down to the wire with this last 2 weeks of the United, because I know our organization definitely is, and I just, want to empathize with the rest of other organizations that are in the home stretch of this fundraising campaign, because
Gotcha. There's about 15, 16 organizations still on the call. Showing
Yeah.
hands. I know some folks have their microphone off. Rachel, how's it feeling at your end? How are you all doing?
I mean, this is our first time, what we call sitting at the grown-up table. So it's, we're proud of the effort that we've done so far, and we're hoping that some people kind of pull as well.
All right.
Well,
Anybody
Rachel,
else?
I manage the campaign, and to let you know, and I see a few more people that are from the groups on here that are participating in the collaborative campaign. A lot happens in the last 2 weeks. So a lot of gifts can come in during the last 2 weeks. It will be very nail biting, but a large portion of the gifts do come in the last 2 weeks. So
Right.
hope that makes you feel a little bit better.
One last
Lost
comment,
company.
by the way, on the lead slide, my email address is there. You all should have seen it by now. If you have a question for whatever reason you can't get to now, feel free to email. There's no cost, there's no obligation. I'm not going to try to sell you anything. I'm genuinely here to help you advance your mission. I really value the arts and cultural organizations and the difference that you all make in our community. So please feel free to follow up with a question if you've got one. If I don't see you at the May session, then there may be one in June. Remember, board, plan, fundraise. But other questions, while some folks are still here, let me be quiet and let somebody else ask a question.
And I'll make sure to include Dr. Curtis's email on the post-meeting email as well.
Covington, I see you speaking, but you're muted. I see Covington on the screen, so I'm not sure this gentleman's name, but I cannot hear you if you are speaking. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah, not
I'm
sure.
sure, but there we go.
There you go. Yes, sir.
Okay. I was just stating that this is my first time on this Zoom call with you guys, but we have a new board that we just actually put together, and it's for So You Want to Name and Lights. But I am very interested, and I'm very much enlightened about what I'm hearing and how to go about putting together a board. Very important, for us, because this is our first time. And matter of fact, we just actually established a board. So I just appreciate, the learning experience that we're getting and listening to what you're doing.
That's great. Thank you. How many board members do you have?
4
Four.
at this time. Yes.
Good place to start. And again, the best practices, that cliche you've heard, there's no reason why as a startup nonprofit with 4 board members, you can't practice the best practices of big, large, mature nonprofits. Board recruitment, orientation, job descriptions, and all of that stuff in most cases is free of charge. Just go Google it. Board bylaws, board job descriptions, some of the things I've given you, so you can begin right at the very beginning of practicing the things that mature boards do when you're 10 and 15 and 20 years old as an organization. So good for you. Good luck to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Be well. Anybody else? All right. You all be well. Go forth. Make a difference in the world. Get your shot or keep your mask on.